So, what we're going to have a quick exploration of today is this idea that science, which most people have this sort of bias that science is a modern thing, that people in the past really didn't think scientifically or anything like that. Now, in some respects, the word science is relatively new, or the field of science, but people have been, I suppose, sciencing for a very long period of time. And it's the way we've gone from, being hunter-gatherers for most of our existence to now, manipulating the world to our own nefarious ideas. And of course, what we need to do is think about a whole range of different things. So, when people go out into places like the bush, and we're not going to actually watch this entire video, we'll just let it buffer in. But this idea that science has come about, things like Stonehenge, which you can just see there at the start of the video, and you guys can go and have a look at this your own time, is that Stonehenge is several thousand years old. I couldn't give you the date off the top of my head. I think it might even be about 10,000 years old. It's very old. But it's an example of science, because the modern idea of what it was it was a calendar. And it wasn't for religious or sacrifices or anything like that. But simply, the people who lived in that area, they'd go at the start of the day, at the dawn, and they'd say, oh, the sun's coming up through this stone here. This must mean it's almost winter time. We need to gather food. Or, it's going to get very hot soon. We better make sure that we're putting crops into the ground. We're doing this, we're doing that. And that's thinking scientifically. They worked out that if the sun was coming out at a certain point, that meant that they had different jobs to do. And that was really crucial to moving from this nomadic existence to settling down into villages and societies and that there. Now, of course, these dates are very fluid. The syllabus, I think, was written in 2017. And even there is archaeological evidence in the last few years, which kind of pushes Indigenous Australian culture back possibly even another 20 or 30,000 years. And this is the problem when you're dealing with things in the past with not much evidence. There is a lot of inference in there. And one of the things there is that this idea that when Western society came to Australia and they saw that, these people that they sort of considered to be simpler and, less developed and that there, for the simple reason that the Indigenous cultures really hadn't developed a written language. They were using things like stories, dance, ceremonies to pass information on. And from a philosophical or brain science point of view, while sort of dreaming stories and dances and that seem, well, okay, it's something that we in the modern world do for fun, it actually passed on information. The stories would talk about certain aspects of nature. And this is really important because your brain remembers stories, dances, and things like that better than it remembers facts. Despite most of the kids in this school, the racial background and all that there, I remember the last celebration day I ran a little disco thing, and every single kid in there knew that stupid dance to Nutbush. And that's the thing. Dances and things like that are cultural. And I think in a lot of subcontinental cultures as well, dancing is such an important thing. And so one of the stories there, probably one of the best known ones, is the emu in the sky, and talks about, the emu appears in a certain time of the year, and when it starts to rise in the sky, it means that they're going into winter. And so the Indigenous people there, they went around and collected emu eggs. And so in the story was about an emu, and the emu was giving them the eggs for, part of, for a food source. And in this case here, the emu disappears in June, which says that, the emus have already hatched and that food resource is no longer available. So even though it's a story, it actually has meaning. which beyond what we normally sort of associate here. And of course, there are some parts there. I can't remember exactly where this is from, but the Skyemia here, which is essentially just the outer edge of the Milky Way, or the edge of the Milky Way there, and some rocks actually have a depiction of that on there. And again, it seems like it's just a simple story, but there's meaning under it. Also, there's a whole heap of other things there. Spinifex grass, common in sort of the arid parts of Australia. And if you take the sap out of there, you can actually get a glue. And so if you're making tools, even if you're making dwellings, you're making anything, you get the glue, you get the Spinifex resin, and it's a glue. And it's quite a common one. And fire management, and this is probably the one that gets a lot of kudos in the last couple of years, ever since those giant 2019 bushfires around the country. And one of the things there is that Indigenous people all across Australia actually used fire management. And so what we consider to be the Australian landscape has actually been carved over tens of thousands of years. And part of the reason, and this goes back, I think it was 2003, there were the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria. And part of the problem there was that people had said, well, no, let's stop destroying the environment. Let's just let it grow. And one of the things, there's a symbiotic relationship between the Indigenous people and the land. And they would burn through parts of the land which would promote growth. And the forests evolve over time to a point where most Australian flowers, or a good portion of Australian flowers and natives and things like that, need fire to germinate seeds. They need fire to clear out the dense underbush or underbrush, which means that the plants can get a source of fertilizer. And that's the thing, burnt organic material is one of the best fertilizers you can get there. And so in Australia, when we came through and we said, oh, we're these really clever Westerners coming through, we said, no, let's just let it go. Let's let the fire management go. Whereas now, a lot of forest areas are using these Indigenous ideas. So particularly around Sydney, you get a lot of backburning. And backburning is just the same as what Indigenous people have been doing for a long period of time. And you go through, and all this brush, all this stuff here clears it out. It promotes new growth of plants, the new growth in terms of what the Indigenous people did, the new growth of plants. Some of them are edible, but also new plant growth encourages small animals to come in there. So wallabies, kangaroos, things like that, another food source. Also, one of the things here, and Sydney not too much, but if you go to the northern parts of Australia, the traditional 4 seasons, summer, winter, autumn, and spring, don't make sense. In the Northern Territory and sort of the Northern Cape parts of Australia, basically it's either hot and humid or it's hot and dry. In places like Tasmania, it's cold and dry and cold and wet. So different Indigenous mobs had different calendars and different ways of interacting with the seasons there. Sydney, we're on that sort of plane where there's it's close to that traditional idea, but you got to remember the 4 seasons is a very Eurocentric idea because they do have 4 distinct seasons. And of course, this understanding which seasons are coming also gives you an idea of, what creatures are going to come. We're going to get an influx of growth and things like that. Okay, moving on to this European idea is that in most of your textbooks, you're going to see that the start of the modern scientific idea comes from the ancient Greeks. And it does to some extent. The Western tradition of this idea is that the Greeks pretty much started everything. It does kind of, and we'll talk about these other societies in a minute, but it does kind of ignore the Asian societies a little bit. And part of that is China, particularly China, has had this almost xenophobic thing. They've sort of stopped people coming in. It's not a modern thing with the modern Chinese Communist Party or anything like that. It's a deep held tradition within there. But modern mathematics, most of the maths you learnt up until probably the end of year 10 comes from ancient Greece. So Euclid, we still talk now about Euclidean geometry. Euclidean geometry is something it's been around for over 2,000 years. Maths is just maths. The ancient Greeks also developed astronomy. And it could be argued also the Indians actually did this before the Greeks, but they just didn't get in the textbooks early enough. There are things like around that time, this thing called the a little non-digital analog computer, which was found there. And I think we briefly talked about it last time when we were talking about navigation. They looked up at the sky. They also developed the first medicine, or not so much the first scientific medical way of thinking. And so all modern Western doctors, again, when they become an official doctor, take the Hippocratic Oath. And Hippocrates was the first person to really sort of realize that diseases had natural causes. Before then, people would consider, well, I'm getting this disease because I've got demons in me. And so the demons had to be released. Now, even though Hippocrates and that started this, there still was a long, long way to go. Obviously, without microscopes and things like that, you can't actually see microbes, which are the cause of a good portion of diseases there. And they talked about things like humours and stuff like that. So if you had a fever, it's because you had too much blood. So they'd use things like leeches and bloodletting and stuff like that. But everything has to have a start. Biology. So one of the things there, people like Aristotle, whole heap of people there, started observing animals and started classifying animals, and did that just on their characteristics. And of course, that's where you get sort of interesting things there. But, it was a start. Also, simple inventions. Watermill. So, in prior to sort of the modern world, the reason you had a windmill for the most part was to grind up grain. And so the Greeks came up with an early idea there. Plato came up with an alarm clock, kind of almost like if you've seen those Rube Goldberg machines where, one thing hits another and there's that there. It just used a bit of water to trigger something there. Central heating. So they had pipes and transferring air around there. The crane, another thing there, and also Archimedes' screw, a way of getting water uphill. Now, some of these things, obviously, some are used. So the idea of central heating, particularly in Europe, is still a big thing, particularly in the colder regions. But again, a start. And of course, Archimedes is well known for that idea of using the idea of density to work out, whether his king was being screwed over on a crown deal. Again, you can have a look at these things as well in your own time. But let's go to ancient Egypt, because ancient Egypt, probably its most important development that we still think about today is development of writing. Now, they weren't the first to really do this. It's just probably more than anything else, the best preserved that we've got there. And of course, they wrote in hieroglyphics. And hieroglyphics, just little stylized images that convey meaning. And I suppose you could also argue that hieroglyphics and Asian writing, particularly the Chinese and I think Korean, particularly the Chinese, which symbols have meanings and that there. In the Western tradition, we sort of condense that down into a small amount of letters that can be combined. But the Egyptians also were able to develop paper. Prior to that, if you wanted to write something down, you had to get a chisel, you had to get a clay tablet, you had to put it all in there. But they developed things like papyrus. They also, at the same time as well, used leather, animal hide, to write things down. And of course, as most things in society, as it's developed, most of this was writing down religious stuff, and particularly in the ancient Egyptians had multiple gods and that there. Also, medicine. Now, if you've ever watched TV shows like Horrible Histories or anything like that, ancient people did have some pretty messed up ideas on things. And often this is a bit of trial and error and stuff there. So, honey in human brains to cure eye infections. So you get a bit of conjunctivitis, you got to go get someone's brain mixed up with some honey and just rub it on your eyes. And the whole cooking a whole mouse thing to cure coughs, I think that just worked because as soon as you knew they were cooking a mouse for you, your cough went away. And of course, I think we talked briefly last week about this idea of there's evidence of, particularly in ancient Egypt, that some people who had things like migraines would have holes drilled in their skull, which was to relieve them of the spirits. Funnily enough, it released pressure on the brain and made them feel better. Numbers. Now, of course, the ancient Egyptians used a lot of the numbers. They used a system similar to what we've got now, and they kind of had the forerun of what became Roman numerals, but they didn't really have a zero or anything like that. And of course, this was all about money. When you have an organized society, you have people taking on different roles. And so if your mate Abdul, the pyramid builder, wants to get some lunch, and Ahmed, I can't even think of an Egyptian food, is bringing in some food, he wants a little bit of payment for that. And so if you want to start having commerce, you need to have numbers. You need to have a way of, I give you this amount of money for this, that, and there. And this is just some of the ways numbers were represented. Now, of course, you have a look at that there. It does seem a little bit overly complicated, but you can argue then that our modern system is actually pretty good. One of the things there, Egyptians wore makeup, very, very common. And one of the things you see in a lot of the movies and stuff there is that, particularly around their eyes, they had a black makeup around their eyes. And it wasn't because they were proto-goths and getting into death metal or anything like that. It simply was that the dark makeup actually reduced sun glare, because a lot of sun glare you get is just reflection off your skin, and makeup as well protected your skin because there was a layer between you and the sun stuff coming in. And Egypt is pretty much in that equatorial zone as well, so it's quite hot. Toothpaste as well, one of the things there, they developed bread and stuff like that, but it had crap in it. And so, ancient people did have problems with their teeth. They had a lot of problems. A lot of people didn't have any teeth. And so the Egyptians, were able to come up with something like a toothpaste, with a whole heap of weird stuff in there. Ashes, eggshells, ox hooves, just in case you want to turn vegan as well. And of course, that is a ancient little type toothbrush thing there. Basically just some hairs, probably is hair from like a tail of a donkey or something, and you just brush the crap out of your teeth. Now, we're going to do a quick little trip into Indian science here, and this is one of the things there. Like a lot of you guys have obviously Indian subcontinental backgrounds, so Indian science actually probably predates most of this Western science. It's just that, it wasn't seen because our Western tradition, we didn't really look at the Asian countries too much there. So you got someone there like Aryabhata came up with this idea of zero. And, because of the number zero, maths actually works a lot better with zero. It actually makes things so much easier. And, we can talk about every single number now using only 10 symbols, as opposed to you look at that Egyptian thing there, which was like more complex numbers there. So we can talk about any number just using 10 symbols. And of course, zero is happy to help us. One of the things there, a scientist called Kanad, he came up with atomic theory. So we talk about John Dalton, and I think that's the late 1700s, early 1800s. And Kanad came up with this idea of Anu. Again, small, indestructible particles. He also came up with some really interesting ideas there as well, rest and motion, which is something that's really important in the modern quantum mechanical models of the atoms there. You talked about diatomic molecules, triatomic molecules. And look, what's amazing about Kanad is that, he did this without being able to do sort of these experiments on that there. So a really interesting thing there. And you can go into it a little bit more, have a look on YouTube for a few of those things there as well. One of the other things as well, in the Western tradition, we talk a lot about that the geocentric theory of the universe was promoted by some ancient Greeks, but it took 2,000 years for it to be overturned. The Indians, on the other hand, were some of the earliest astronomers using telescopes and using mathematical predictions. And Aryabhata, which we quickly mentioned before, he said, well, we revolve around the sun. It explained everything. And of course, this is a thing that we don't talk about often because it's not really in our textbooks and that there. But, the Indians knew about the solar system well before the rest of the world really understood it. And of course, have a look at some of the stuff on Aryabhata. Amazing guy. Also, plastic surgery. This is the one here. It's a little bit squeamish here because one of the things there is in the 6th century, over 2,500 years ago, Samhita was doing surgery. One of them was this thing called rhinoplasty, or working with the nose. Some of the ancient things there, if you did something there, they, as a punishment, cut off your nose. Basically, it doesn't kill you, it maims you. And so he was able to do things like reconstructing noses so that people didn't look as bizarre as the punishment was intended. Cataract surgery. Now, this is another one here about the same time that, using a needle. They would go in there and stuff around with your eyes. Now, if any of you out there have tried to even just put contact lenses in, the first few times you do it, it's really hard to do. You do get used to it. But yeah, they were doing surgery, successful surgery. And you can, of course, have a look at those things there.